So I was going to talk almost exclusively about what the title says, which is what it was like to be a journalist there, and I am going to talk about that, but I thought, given what is going on right now, I should spend a few minutes first on where we are, because we are, it seems to me, at a kind of hinge point in the Middle East, possibly. It seems that the Trump administration and the King of Saudi Arabia have plans, and we don't know what they are, but we should contemplate them, because there's a lot going on. And there are a lot of plans being made. And today's front page of the Times had a Peter Baker piece basically saying that Jared Kushner's group is organizing something without any details of what they're organizing. And it's not that I have any secret information, but we do know a few things. We know that for several years, Israel, if you talk to Israeli security people, they will say to you, another war with Hezbollah is not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. We need to worry about the 100,000 missiles that are underground in southern Lebanon aimed at us, and some of them are long range, which means they could reach Tel Aviv. Some of them may have guidance on them, and it's a serious affair. And they've also been very active in Syria. They're, of course, supported heavily by Iran, and so we are very worried about them. And we expect a war will occur, and we just want to make sure it occurs on our schedule, not on theirs. Now, I can tell you that when I was there from 2008 to 12, we kept hearing that there was a likely attack on Iran, and it didn't happen. So this may not happen either. And my sense is that there are sort of parallel tracks. One is the talk, and the talk stands for something on its own, but there is also the preparation. And they really did almost bomb Iran in 10 and in 12. I mean, we think they came very close to doing so. And I think that a war with Hezbollah is not unlikely at all. Now, right now, what we've seen is that the Saudis, there's a king, but the prince, as we know, is basically seems to be running the show, right? And this Mohammed bin Salman, who's 32, he's just basically removed the prime minister of Lebanon. It seems without the prime minister of Lebanon particularly wanting to be removed. We're not certain, but so it appears. He was on television today saying, no, I left of my own free will, and it's because of Iran and Hezbollah. And I'm not saying he's not afraid of Iran and Hezbollah, but I do think that the Saudis have sort of put into place a kind of program which involves removing him, have told their compatriots, the Saudis, to leave Lebanon. And there does seem to be some kind of grand plan underway, which may involve an Israeli attack on Hezbollah. Now, one of the things that if you talk to Israeli security officials of the last couple of years, which I try to do, what they'll say to you is, we're no longer making a distinction between Hezbollah and Lebanon. The next war will not be aimed just at the southern Beirut suburbs, but we feel that basically Lebanon is in the hands of Hezbollah and Iran, and we're going to take seriously, more seriously, any kind of war aimed at infrastructure and so forth, if that's what happens, if it comes to that. So, of course, there's also the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it is clear that the plan for many years was the sort of inside out, right, that the Israelis and Palestinians would come to some arrangement, and then the idea was that it would have reverberations in the region, and that American interests and the things that we care about in the region will be improved because of this deal. Basically, the failure of an attempt to reach such a deal has created the outside-in concept that the Trump administration believes in, and seems to be persuading the Saudis of the same. I'm not sure who's persuading whom. We do think that Jared Kushner and the prince get along very well. They are both princes in a certain way, and have the advantage of youth and the disadvantage of youth. and the belief that sort of their time has come, and maybe it has. So we know that there is talk of some kind of pushback against Iran by the Saudis. We see the war in Yemen as a proxy war between the Saudis and the Iranians. We know that Qatar has been isolated because of its relationship with Iran by the Saudis and the other Gulf kingdoms that tend to line up behind the Saudis. And we know that the Saudis and the Gulf kingdoms and Israel have been quietly improving their relationship quite substantially. There is real commerce that goes on quietly. Some of it has to do with security equipment. You remember in 2010 in the UAE, Hamas arms smuggler was killed by a bunch of Mossad agents, and the Dubai police had put together all of this film and was able to show us that these Mossad guys came and killed this guy. I have heard, although I haven't actually verified, that that equipment was sold to the UAE by Israel. But anyway, so that would be fascinating, right, that they used the equipment against Israel to demonstrate what they were doing there. Anyway, that is all happening. And there remains this sort of bone in the throat, which is the Palestinian conflict, the failure for there to be full rights for Palestinians or a sense of a Palestinian state. And so in this grand bargain, it seems likely that what is being cooked up is an assertion that will tell the Israelis and the Palestinians, okay, here's our plan that you guys should sign on to. There'll be a pushback in Lebanon, there'll be a pushback in Qatar, there'll be a pushback in Iran, and there'll be, I would guess, if this happens, the movement of the American embassy to West Jerusalem and some huge Marshall Plan-like affair. This is all speculation on my part. Please do not expect it to be true, but it could be true. And it could also be, like the Iran situation, that it's all talk to create diplomatic pressure to force certain changes that won't require military activity. So that's where we stand right now, and it's not an unserious situation. I really do think that the risk of conflagration in the Middle East is quite significant right now because of what's happening. And so I just wanted to lay that on the table, even though it wasn't the core topic of my talk, which is about what it was like to be a reporter based in Jerusalem, which I will now talk to you about. And then when we finish, I'm happy to deal with it all in whatever you want to talk about. So I was there from 08 to 12, as the rabbi just said, and I'd actually done 2 earlier tours in Israel, one from 91 to 97 for the Boston Globe, where I did the whole region, and 83 to 85 for Reuters in Jerusalem as well. So I'm really a kind of repeat offender. I spent 12 years as a reporter in the place, and that helped me get a great sense of a lot of the things that are happening there. My wife is Israeli, so I'm kind of in up to my neck. All right. So I'll start at the end. When I left in 2012, what I wanted to do, and I was being replaced by a woman named Jody Rudoran for the Times. What I wanted to do was to hold something which New York Times correspondents have done for 20 or 30 years, which is to hold a goodbye party for me and a hello party for Jody. And one of the things that has traditionally been true in Jerusalem for journalists and NGOs and government types is that you can bring Palestinians and Israelis together for those events. Historically, it happened quite a lot. So we sent out our invitations to Israelis and Palestinians, and the Israelis all came back to us, and we heard nothing from the Palestinians. And then finally, we got a phone call from the spokesman of the PA government at that time, whose name was Ghassan Khatib, who said to me, Ethan, I'd be happy to come say goodbye, and I do want to meet Jody, but we are in Ramallah, and you are holding this party in Jerusalem, and for us to come to Jerusalem, we have to get permission from the Israelis, and we're not willing to ask, so we're not going to come. So I said, okay, I understand that. He said, but I have an idea. Why don't you hold a separate goodbye party for the Palestinian officials in Ramallah? And I said, okay, we'll hold a second party in Ramallah. That's fine. And then he called me the next day and he said, but you know what? We don't want to cede Jerusalem to the Jews, so we'd like you to hold a third party in East Jerusalem for the Palestinians in East Jerusalem. I said, okay, we'll hold a third party. So we had 3 goodbye parties, which is, I think, quite symbolic of where we stand right now in the relationship between the two peoples. And the first of the goodbye parties that happened was the East Jerusalem one, and it was held at an institution called PASIA, which stands for something like Palestinian Association for Study of International, and it's funded by North Europeans, and it's headed by a guy whose name you still see in the paper. His name is Mahdi Abdelhadi, and he's not either Fatah or Hamas. He's kind of an outlier, an interesting guy, and he likes to have diplomats and other people around, and so but we were going to have it there, and intellectuals. But what I did not know is that he had been negotiating with young radical Palestinians to try to get them to be involved more in his institute. And so he wanted them to come while I was there, but they said, well, you know, they had their sort of social media engagement among themselves saying, well, we should boycott this because, you know, the New York Times, the Jews, you know, we have to have no normalization. And then a group of them decided they would come. So they came to the thing, and I stood up to begin a little presentation. And at one point, within a minute or two of my starting, a guy stands up and says, why should we even listen to you when we know that the New York Times is just a Zionist rag? And I said, well, do you read the New York Times? He said, I don't need to read it. I know what it stands for. And then I started to try to answer that, and then another person stood up and said, and I want to know, are you proud of your son? So my second son, if you don't remember or don't care, you now have to care for at least a minute, decided to serve in the Israeli army while I was a reporter there. It got out. It was sort of written about on anti-Israel websites, and there was a big sort of campaign to the public editor to try to have me removed from my job. Actually, the public editor thought it wasn't a bad idea to remove me from my job, but the executive editor said, we don't plan to do that, and the public editor is just he has no power at the paper, just an advisory role. So anyway, I said, you know, really my relationship with my son is kind of between me and him, and are you proud of your son? So I said, you know, I'm proud of my son. So the 9 of them who had come to confront me all stood up and walked out. That was our first goodbye party. Goodbye. The second party was in Ramallah, and it was held we have a stringer of the Times, no longer we. The Times has a guy who's based in Ramallah, and he organized it. And so I went there with Jody and Isabel Kirshner, who's the full-time number 2 person in the Bureau, and Rina Castelnuova, who was for many years our photographer there. And we are driving there, and you know, if you've ever tried to cross from Israel into the West Bank or vice versa, you know that sometimes complications occur. And this was one of those days when there were 100 cars in front of us, some security thing that had gotten in the way. People couldn't move. It was getting late. We were half an hour late to our party. We sort of ditched our car and ran. We got there, and the hummus had that kind of crust thing going on. You know, it was very depressing. And a lot of the officials had sort of come and gone, so it was not the greatest goodbye party either. That was the second goodbye party. But it was emblematic of of that whole problem of that border. So the third one in West Jerusalem, across from the YMCA, not the King David, but across on next door there, was a big, beautiful venue with, you know, as you know, if you don't know, you should know, Israel has become an amazing place to eat and to drink. There were delicious food, there was wonderful wine, there were dozens and dozens of people. And the thing that was fascinating was that we had, of course, very few Palestinians, but we did have 2 Palestinians at this party, and they were the Palestinians who worked for the New York Times, one in the West Bank and the other in Gaza. So the guy from Gaza, we were able to get the army to let him out, to come for this transition. Wonderful guy named Faris Akram, who's no longer at the Times, he moved to the AP. But these are years where there's no contact between citizens of Gaza and Israeli officials at all. Israelis are barred from going to Gaza, both by Gazan law and by Israeli law. And so there were several government ministers at this party, and there's this guy from Gaza standing there, and the guys who come with the ministers, who are like always talking into their sleeves, are like getting a little nervous about what's going on. And it was fascinating to watch men in kippot and members of the government talking to Faris and saying, so what's life like in Gaza now? It's very rare for there to be relationships of any kind, and it was an amazing thing to observe. Also at that event was our guy Khalid Abu Akr, who's a Ramallah correspondent for us, as I mentioned, also no longer with the paper. And there was something else you should know about both Faris and Khalid, which is that Faris's father died by an Israeli missile that was an errant missile in the 08-09 Gaza war. He was a Fatah guy. They weren't going after him, but he was on his farm and it killed him. And Khalid's father was arrested for being a Fatah activist, imprisoned, and died in prison in 1970 when Khalid was 4. Now, Khalid and the lore in his world is that his father was tortured to death. I've never looked into it, and I don't know whether he was or wasn't. Certainly not impossible. It was early years in those days. But what's interesting here is that you have Khalid and Faris and I, all of whom work together. My son joins the security services that effectively killed both of their fathers, and we have a relationship that is quite tight. We had each other's back. When I'm in Gaza, I need Faris with me, and Khalid is taking care of me, and I'm also, when Khalid or Faris have problems with the Shin Bet or anybody else, I get on the phone and I secure their release and worry about them. So these two guys with whom I work most closely, as I say, both victims of the security system that my own son had joined. And yet we trusted each other, we worked closely together, and we all knew that we were linked by a belief that in truth-seeking, in trying to get the story as subtle, as complex, and complete as possible. And we also knew that we trusted one another, and we knew something else, which is that any chance of a broader coexistence in Israel and among the Palestinians has been fading very, very rapidly for the last years. And that relationships like this are increasingly rare and kind of vanishingly rare. As I said to you, I started as a reporter in Jerusalem in 1983, so it's now almost 35 years. And I can measure the arc of mutual disdain over these 3+ decades that I've spent reporting on the place. Because in 1983, when I got there, if you were a Gazan, you got in and you wanted to have dinner in Tel Aviv, you got in your car, you drove to Tel Aviv, you had dinner, and you drove home. There wasn't a checkpoint, there wasn't a soldier, there was nothing stopping you from doing it. And in fact, I, as a reporter in 1983-4, could drive to the northern border of Israel, call the UN, tell them I wanted to go into Lebanon, walk across the border, hail a cab, and go to Sidon or Beirut. These things are completely unimaginable today, as if any of you have been there, know. Saab Erekat, who's the chief PLO, he's been the chief negotiator for the Palestinians and the chief of the PLO recently, and is from Jericho, used to then write, in those days, 30 years ago, write editorials for Al-Quds out of Jericho, used to say, please occupy me again because I want to go back to where I could get in a car with my wife and go where I wanted to go and not have to deal with barriers and fences and walls. So these barriers and fences and walls that are checkpoints that are everywhere today, and I don't say this that it's an inexcusable thing. We know why they're there. We know that after the PLO supported the Saddam Hussein in the 1991 Iraq War, and the second Intifada broke out, and so forth, we know that many, many Israelis died. And we know that in the second Intifada, in April of 2001, 400 Israelis died from exploding bus bombs, from suicide bombers and so forth. So the point isn't to say that this is all crazy and a bad idea. It is to say, though, that it has created a set of circumstances, and the real question is whose interests are served and whether Israel's interests are served. And I'm not here to answer the question, really only to raise it. When I first started going to Israel, well, not when I first started going, when I first started working there in the 80s, there were about 100,000, 150,000 Palestinians that worked in Israel every day. It was not a relationship among equals. Israel was the rich country. It was the US, and the Palestinians, if you like, were the Mexican workers. But it meant there was human interaction between the two populations. It meant, for example, that if your Palestinian worker who was fixing your mirpeset, or who came and was your gardener or worked on your construction crew, if his kid was going to get married, he invited you, and you went. You would go to Hebron, you'd go to Ramallah, you'd go to Nablus for the wedding, you would sit, you might shop, you might get your car fixed, and he knew that if your mother was sick, he knew your mother because she was sick and she lived there. So there was actual human interaction, quite common in those years. Today, and I can tell you something else, by the way, in the 90s, when Arafat came back and there was the beginning of, attempted peace, the Oslo process, I remember being in the streets of Gaza and people saying to me, this is fantastic, I can't wait to go back to work in Israel. I don't hate the Israelis, I just want them off my neck. Now, I'm not saying that that is universally representative of the Palestinian attitude, or even if it was 25 years ago, but it was a real phenomenon. Today, the only Israelis that Palestinians meet are at the end of a gun, right? There's almost no dialogue groups left anymore, and the truth is the Palestinians have become viciously anti-Israel. They've got this whole BDS anti-normalization thing, which is quite problematic. And Israelis have also stopped thinking about Palestinians. They're out of their mind. I don't mean they're out of their mind. I mean they no longer are in their mind. They don't think about them, okay? There used to be, in the 90s when I was there were reporters in Gaza for Israeli media. There are none. It's illegal, and it's dangerous, and they're not there anymore. And basically, you have a kind of large welfare state in Gaza. The guy I was talking to you about, Faris, he's, as I said, he's joined the AP. I just got a note from him this morning, actually, that his wife and daughters are moving to Canada because 3 hours of electricity a day. I mean, these are people committed to Gaza, Gazans for many years, and they just can't take it anymore. They've applied for asylum in Canada. He's going to try to retrain and move to Canada. And it's heartbreaking for anyone who's, when you have a relationship with people like this, it does break your heart. I would say at the same time that in Gaza, there is a very small portion of the population that's pro-Hamas. It is certainly not a majority. I would say half the population thinks a plague on both your houses to Fatah and Hamas. The other half is probably 60-40 pro-Hamas. And that's how they stay in power. It's not the poorest place in the world. It's not the most densely populated area in the world. All those things you're told are not really true. It is a poor, sad place. But there are many poorer and sadder places. The main thing is there is no nothing to look forward to. And that is just very heartbreaking for anyone who has built human relations there. Of course, in the last 6 years, as we see the region blowing up, internal issues, we see that the Palestinian issue is not the most central issue for the whole region, as anyone knew anyway before. But it was a plausible argument before that if only you can solve the Palestinian problem, then the region can kind of calm down. I never believed it, but we now for sure know that that's not true. And we see the rise of other forces, the Sunni Shia problems and the Islamist problem, huge issue. And so some people say, well, how can you expect Israel to do anything while this storm is underway? It's like putting a tent up in a hurricane, so just hang tight. Or others say this is your moment to actually create an island of democracy and mutual support in a place like Israel-Palestine. I'm not here to take a stand on it, but those are the two sort of strong arguments, and fundamentally, as we know, a Likud-led government has taken the first argument seriously and the second not. And, you know, I will say that I do think that the idea, to go back to my early point, which is that, you know, about the Jared Kushner plan, the sort of big outside-in thing, is that it will not work. I don't think that the Arab world will accept a situation where there isn't something for the Palestinians, something real. It's no question that there's all kinds of internal issues for the Arab world. It's not all about the Palestinians, but it is also, they are a symbol for them. Keith Dayton, who is a three-star U.S. general, retired U.S. general, who was training Palestinian forces in the years that I was in Jerusalem from 08 to 12, used to tell a story. He's not a Middle Eastern guy. His military experience was in the former Soviet Union. And his first job in the Middle East was to go look for weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Okay, that didn't go too well. But he did tell me that he was fascinated going into Republican Guard barracks in Iraq, 1,000 miles from Israel, and seeing graffiti inside the barracks, not for our consumption, of a snake strangling the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The snake was Israel, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, of course, you know. So he said, look, there is enormous feeling about this issue deep into the Arab world, and I think he was right about that. So I first got to Israel in 1965 as a 10-year-old kid, and my father was on sabbatical at the Weizmann Institute. He was a scientist. So I've seen this place for a long time, and I can tell you that today Israel is a rich country. It is a fantastic success story. It has got more companies on the NASDAQ than any other country other than China and Germany or something. It's got it's joined the OECD, the Rich Countries Club, in 2009 or 10 when I was there. And, you know, we used to tell a joke. The Jews used to like to tell themselves, well, why did the Jews wander 40 years in the desert? Because they were looking for the one place in the Middle East without any oil or gas. And they found it. We can hang that joke up because there is a huge amount of natural gas off the shore of Haifa. And it will turn Israel into an energy exporter in the coming years. So it is a country now of enormous wealth, a very vibrant society, incredible television, cinema, literature. I mean, it's really an exciting place to be, Tel Aviv, and that whole area. But the paradox is, it's never been safer, it's never been richer, it's never been more quiet. There's virtually no terrorism in Israel today. And all those other things are amazing, and it's got, you know, I think its GDP per capita is in the middle of the EU, more or less, in that area. But it hasn't figured out how to share its land with 5 million Palestinians. This kind of existential issue is essentially being pushed aside. Now, there's been a sort of stalemate on this issue really since the Oslo Accords of 1993. So that's almost a quarter of a century. My experience as a reporter was that the impact of that kind of stagnation was to decide that the problem isn't what we're doing, the problem is the people who are telling the story. The problem is the journalists. They're not getting the story right, and if they get the story right, then we might be able to fix this thing. So there was a lot of focus on our articles and reports. And it really sort of started to take over a lot of the discussion about the conflict. When I was there in those years, I used to come back and give speeches and see, of course, my parents and come back to the paper. And so one time I was about to come back for a visit, and an Israeli friend of mine meets me and says, so I understand you're going back to America, and I understand that you're giving a few talks, so whom are you speaking to? And I said, well, you know, I speak to all kinds of, I speak to community groups, I speak like at the 92nd Street Y, I speak to Jewish groups, I speak to college groups. So he sort of grabs me and he says, well, you tell those college students that Israel is not a fascist, racist, apartheid state. I said, okay, I will. And what should I tell the Jews? He said, tell the Jews it is. It really happened. I'm not making that story up. And the point, of course, is to some extent that the The way you can tell this story is there are so many ways to do it. And there is such a relative nature to the truths and the falsehoods. The black and white battle that you have there my role was to try to traffic not in black and white, but to try to traffic in gray. And I will say that's a good way to get everyone to hate you, and there was a level of success there, I have to admit. When you're abroad, every foreign correspondent wants to tell readers back home two contradictory things. On the one hand, you want to say, hey, the people here, I know they don't talk your language. I know they have a different religion, that they may even dress differently from you, and they may be a different color from you, but these people love their children, they eat ice cream, they go to movies, they live life the way you do. They are human beings just like you and me. And on the other hand, you want to tell your readers back home that if you think that by understanding the humanity of the people here, that you understand them, no, believe me, that's false. These people have a set of cultural assumptions, religious assumptions, societal hierarchies that you do not share. And if you are not willing to try to examine those things, you'll never understand what's going on here. These people are completely different from you and me. And so you feel as a correspondent kind of toggling between these two thoughts, both of which are fundamentally true and, of course, the opposite one of the other. The other thing is that everybody gets bad press. There really kind of isn't good press, right? The whole point of the press is to point to difficulties and conflicts. And this is not just true in Israel-Palestine. It's true in every country. The India correspondent, the Brazil correspondent, the South Africa, they're all hated by their locals. They all think that they're out to get them. Why do you hate us so much? It's the same thing that I used to get there. It's not just, by the way, abroad. I mean, in New York, the New York Times doesn't write stories about the million people who went to work that day and went home and had dinner with their family. They write about the guy who got thrown in the East River with a bullet in his head, right? So it's a very different kind of, it's not State Department reporting. It is about conflict. And that's why we have reporters in Israel. And that's why if it feels that they're focusing on the bad, it's true. They are. That's their job. I would say, by the way, it's not unique to journalism. I would say that it's kind of how we tell the stories about ourselves as well. Bad news is more important than good news. If you go on vacation in Italy and have a great week and eat pasta and see the Pietà and so forth, and on your 6th day, your luggage is stolen, you are beaten up, that forever is going to be the week that your luggage was stolen and you were beaten up. I just think it's how we tell ourselves stories. Journalists aren't creative enough to go beyond the way humanity talks to itself. There are, I don't know, 50 or 70 New York Times foreign correspondents, and so they have more than one story to tell, since there are 200 countries out there. And if you're the person in Rio, you also have Argentina to cover, and by the way, those countries don't like each other very much. So you have competing narratives wherever you go, but if you're the Jerusalem correspondent, you have a uniquely difficult job because you have two completely competing narratives with a whole set of terms and language that one is the opposite of the other. So you have what the thing that's sort of snaking its way down along the West Bank that the Israelis call a fence, because that sounds neighborly, that the Palestinians call a wall, because that sounds aggressive, and the New York Times calls a barrier because it hopes it doesn't sound like anything. You have the holy raised spot in the old city that the Palestinians or Muslims call the Haram al-Sharif, the holy sanctuary, and that Jews call the Temple Mount. Now, who's right? Right? Is it a popularity contest? Let's see, 1.7 billion Muslims, 98 Jews. No, that's not too good. Let's not go with the popularity contest. Who was there first? Who was there longest? It's very hard to know. So you end up basically trying to, you say both. You say what the Jews call, what X calls, what Y call, and it becomes much more difficult. And by the way, historically, the New York Times always just called it the Temple Mount, and it took a while for the Palestinians to say, well, why are you calling it that? We don't call it that. And they had a point, and it changed at a certain point. But the idea is that if you're a correspondent, you're looking for neutrality. You're looking to sort of tell a language in a cool, calm way. But neither side actually wants that from you. They want you to get on its side. Some years ago, actually just before I went to Jerusalem, when I was still on the foreign desk, in Westchester, in an Orthodox shul, I was asked to give a talk, and I talked about the difficulty of the wall, fence, and barrier. And afterwards, a woman comes up to me and asks me a question. I refer to the barrier, and she starts pointing at me and saying, fence. You're talking to a fence person now, okay? So she wasn't interested in the concept of neutrality. I think that both sides in this conflict live with the illusion that time is on their side, and the Israelis see the success of the Zionist enterprise over decades and figure this is going to go on and it's going to be great, and it has been great. The Palestinians see what's happening in the region. They see this tiny sliver of Jews and they say this can't possibly last, and they may have a point too. And I would say that each side has worked very, very hard to prevent a two-state solution. It's in the DNA of each national movement to claim the whole area. The continued existence of refugee camps in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Syria, these are aimed at telling people that the Zionist narrative has no legitimacy at all. These kids, these are 8-year-old kids, if you go to those camps, they'll tell you they're from Haifa, they're from Jaffa. They're not from the camp that their parents and grandparents were born in. So that's one thing. And of course, the Israelis have been building settlements which are aimed specifically at preventing another sovereign entity from taking root there. So it seems to me that both have been playing this game, and that doesn't mean they've been playing it equally, and it doesn't mean that that the blame is equal, but it is shared. There are now today more than 600,000 Jews living beyond the Green Line. It's very hard for me to imagine them being moved back in the name of any kind of two-state solution, 67 borders. And because the minimum you'd need to move of those people would be 90 to 100,000. I just cannot imagine an Israeli government doing it. And I would say that neither side, and this is a slightly harsh thing to say, is suffering enough to make the sacrifices needed to really come to a deal that would be acceptable to both. So I'm going to basically stop there. As I said in the beginning, what's happening now is that instead of there being negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis for a sort of inside-out deal, there is a growing sense that something from the outside is going to be, with, admittedly, I think Netanyahu's acceptance up to a point, and possibly Abbas's, pressure to come from an outside in. We'll see where it goes. I think that we are in for a fairly rough ride, though. Thank you very much. Okay, so the question is the decline of the media as an industry and the decreasing attention span, Twitter and so forth. How those things affected the perception of readers like you about the conflict? So my answer is that I'm not an expert in this, and my guess is that my answer is as thoughtful as yours. I mean, I can tell you how it does affect you as a reporter to be in that situation. The Times, by the way, maintains the same size bureau in Jerusalem that it did when I was there, and has for many, many years. It has not cut back, but it is rare. In fact, I think it's the only newspaper with a bureau, with an actual office. The rest are people who work out of their apartments. Not that that's so terrible, but there's an institutional support for the New York Times there. So a couple things about how it changes your work as a journalist. One is that it used to be, and I was just on the edge of it, that you would work all day on a story. You were 7 hours ahead of New York. And then in the evening you'd write your story, and then your editors and you would discuss it at 4 or 5 p.m. New York time. It would go in the paper the next day, and that was it. Now, when something happens in real time on the website, the editors want it up, and they're right to want it up. I can't remember the numbers. As I left the Times, it was something like 60% of people are reading the paper on their phones, right? So it's a whole different experience. What it means is that you need to, sometimes if something will happen, you have less time to reflect on its significance and to ask 8 or 10 people to help you think about it, and you're kind of obliged to come up with a narrative line quickly. And then, you have to face whether you're going to evolve it in the course of the day when you learn more, or somehow stick with it. And that's, I think, a little bit of an issue. What happens if you do change it is that then you get the conspiracy theorists calling up and saying, oh, they obviously got pressure and they had to change it, they changed the headline. There's a lot of nonsense out there. But there's a good side too, which is that you'll put something up and then you'll get an email or a call from someone who sees it in real time, was there, and said, well, I also saw X, and that's interesting. So you also have a kind of democratization of the news process, which is that we're all journalists today. And the other thing is, you as a reader can go onto Haaretz's website, you can go onto the Times of Israel website. You have 15 sources in Israel, in English, that you never had before. And so in many ways, I think, you are well served. You are not well served by the fact that news organizations don't know how to make money and therefore may become less professional. And then you get to this, you began your question about the cool and calm question, and I do think that the result of the challenge to the industry is a kind of greater attitude that goes into some of the writing and broadcasting in order to maintain people's attention. So the gap between opinion and news is shrinking to some extent. I'm not a fan of that at all. So Benjamin Netanyahu it was reported tonight, likely to be indicted soon. How would that affect everything? My guess is there won't be a quick indictment, and if there is, it'll be a very, very slow legal process, a very drawn out. I would guess it would last a couple of years, and therefore, it's possible that he'll be slightly weakened, but he is still the most powerful politician in Israel by far. So I doubt it's going to have an immediate effect. I think he's going to be able to keep it at bay for a while. That doesn't mean that it's not a serious legal issue. I think, the question of bribery and these German submarines and his lawyers and so on, I think these are real issues, but I think they're going to take a while to sort through. And the plan that I began talking with my talk about tonight is on a shorter time span than 2 years. The question is what's the future leadership of the Palestinian Authority? I can't really answer with any depth to the question. It's a great question. It's an important question. There is a huge dearth of leadership in the Palestinian sector. There is, in fact, a dearth of politics in the Palestinian sector. There is a guy, Mohammed Dahlan, who was a Fatah guy in Gaza, who is an enemy of Abbas's and has been hanging out in the UAE and working out all day and looking very buff, I must say. But who's been making deals. Many of them, I'm sure, are not on the up and up, and using the money to some extent to build a political following back home. And he's the most likely guy, but it is not a reason for high confidence, shall we say.
You don't think Barghouti has a future in the Palestinian?
Well, Barghouti's in prison. I cannot see the Israelis letting Barghouti out of prison. He's got 5 consecutive life terms. I just can't see it happening. And by the way, I'm also not convinced that he's such a great leader as much as he's a kind of myth. I'm not saying he's a nothing, but I'm not sure that when it comes time to actually run the show, he's going to prove to be as insightful and as smart as it has been assumed. It's a great question. The question is the growing ultra-Orthodoxification of the Jewish establishment in Israel. Is it a source of some concern in Israel, and are they at all worried about how it affects Jews outside of Israel? It is not the kind of problem that we would like it to be for them. There's an interesting phenomenon in Israel, which is that many people are not really religious. They leave it to those guys, and they're not crazy about the ultra-Orthodox, and there is an issue about incorporating. There were nearly 1 million ultra-Orthodox. It's another whole topic, a fascinating topic. Invite me back another time. I'll be happy to talk to you about it. But seriously, I've spent a lot of time investigating the Haredi world and looking into it, and it's a super interesting topic. But in brief, I don't believe they will be incorporated into the military, which has been talked about, but I don't think it's going to happen. There will be, I think, a portion of them incorporated into the workforce, because you can put people in front of computers and at call centers. You can't have 1 million people whose men don't work. I don't mean to limit it to men, but you know, if you have 9 kids, you're going to have someone taking care of the kids, right? So my guess is they're going to come somewhere near dealing with that problem economically. Liturgically, I don't think they're going to be able to deal with it, and I don't think that they understand how important it is. And I would say something else, and interesting, you probably know more than I. My guess is it annoys you, but it will not actually reduce the support of the Jewish community in this country for Israel. I may be wrong, but that's my instinct. My instinct is that the issues transcend those, and they will irritate you, but you'll hang in there. So can I talk about the role of Russia and what's going on in the Middle East? If I could, it would be great, wouldn't it? I think it's a terrifically important element. Russia has been playing a double game, both playing up to, of course, to Iran, but also to the Saudis. This government in Israel has a pretty good relationship with Putin and with the Russian establishment. You know, this is another whole topic, fascinating topic, which is that there is much less official anti-Semitism in Russia today under Putin than there's ever been in the history of Russia. And it's worked out sort of through the Chabad. He has his own chief rabbi, and Putin has given money to the Jewish museum there. It's a very interesting phenomenon. And Putin visited Israel in 2007, went to find the woman who had been his teacher in high school, discovered that she wasn't living well enough, and bought her an apartment in Tel Aviv. So there's a very interesting, there's a lot of games going on, a lot of stuff happening. I don't know where Russia is going to come out in this thing that I just laid out. I'm sure that they're not going to sign on, but it's possible that, you know, they'll make a deal that it will allow it to go forward. But I don't know. It is an important question. It's very, very unclear at the moment. So the question is Israel's relationship to the network Al Jazeera. You know, Jazeera is a complicated network, right? Qatar-based, pretty friendly to the Iranian narrative, causing a lot of irritation of the Saudi narrative, and of course angering the Israelis too as being too pro-Hamas in its description of what happens in the Holy Land. But on the other hand, it is you know, it's a network with lots of stuff going on, not all uniform, and the Israelis have you know, taken away their press cards and that sort of thing a lot. It is also true that they have interviewed Israeli officials on their network, which is an interesting thing to do. I would say also that when I was talking earlier about the lack of relationship between Israelis and Palestinians, one of the reasons, to me, I think that's significant, is that since the mid-90s, when Jazeera opened in Al Arabiya a few years later, is that Arabs in Israel and Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza no longer watch Israeli television. They watch those networks. And so this is not so much true of Israeli Arabs, but of West Bankers and Gazans. They don't even need to follow in Hebrew. They used to learn Hebrew and watch Israeli TV. Now they watch this. It creates very sort of a binary approach to the narrative, right? And by the way, they also watch Al Manar, which is the Hezbollah station, and Al Quds, which is the Hamas station. So, and I would not be surprised that we would discover some Russian relationship to some of these bots and so forth, and you know, that kind of mucking around in popular media. The question is to try to say more about this outside-in approach that is being led, at least partly by Jared Kushner, and whether it would involve regional acceptance of Israel, at least by the Arab states, or I guess everyone besides Iran and Qatar maybe. I mean, those are reasonable things to imagine, yes. The idea would be, this of course was the Saudi plan put forward, right, by King Abdullah in 2001. I mean, I think he put it forward Just a few weeks before there was a huge explosion in the Second Intifada that made the Israelis not interested anymore. But it certainly would involve that, yes. It would if it's going to work, it's going to have to be a grand plan that involves recognition of Israel, development of a Palestinian state, and so on. But it's talk. I'm just talking up here. It's very easy to talk about these things, and it's easy to imagine, the two princes sitting late up at night in Riyadh planning it. But going from there to there, I don't see it a simple task at all. I mean, the story in the Times today spoke of very, very minor steps, like allowing Israeli planes use airspace above those countries. And that makes sense to me too, that you would start small. My instinct is that these guys think it's time for something big now. Can they do it without causing a world war? I don't know. Well, there's no question that it's aimed at containing Iran. That is the core goal of it. There's no question about that. The idea is Israel says, well, we want to be recognized and we can share this pushing back against Iran. Let's make it part of the bargain. That's my sense of the conversation, but it doesn't mean it's going to go anywhere. The question is, what's the mood in Israel about the Iran deal that the United States and the P5 signed in 2015? So my answer is I don't really know what the mood is. I would say that the security establishment is more willing to accept it than Netanyahu's public stance. They basically think, look, it's a reasonably valuable thing. We do have this 10-year gain to sort of keep them at bay in terms of their nukes. I do think that the broad view in Israel is that the deal wasn't good enough. It was okay, but they could have done better. And the part that they failed on the margins makes a difference, and therefore it should be rethought, certainly in terms of the snapback part of it. That's my sense. And there is generally a sense, too, that the Obama administration's argument that this was going to turn the Iranian government into a more moderate force in the region has not come to pass. And it was a sign of the naivete of that administration and of the European view of Iran and so forth. That, I would say, is fundamentally how Israelis feel about it. But I don't think they get up each morning afraid. But they do think down the road there's an issue. So the question is to try to describe in somewhat more detail what life is like in Gaza, since if it's not the poorest, most densely populated place, so forth, what is it? And what could they do to improve their own situation? Gaza has got about two-thirds of the population is refugees, okay? Meaning that they came, they left what is today Israel and live in Gaza. They don't necessarily all live in refugee camps, but they are refugees by UN definition and by our own understanding of it. That means that when the United Nations Relief and Works Agency was set up for Palestinians, they're still functioning. It's basically an employment agency, a school, an education, health, welfare agency in Gaza. And so 60% of the people's basic needs of food and health and schooling are taken care of. And the other 40% who aren't refugees, they tended to come from more middle class, bourgeois families. So Gaza is a place where 90% of the women are literate. And that is not true in Egypt, it's not true in Jordan, it's not true in, it's not true in much of the region. There's no famine in Gaza, okay? Life sucks in Gaza. Do not get me wrong, okay? You don't have enough electricity. There's a lot of terrible things about it, but it is a kind of open air cage where you do not die and where you get educated and where you live a fairly long life. So that's what I mean by that, okay? I don't want you to come away thinking, well, so let's not worry about Gaza. I don't mean that, but it is important to get our facts straight, right? There's a desire on the Palestinian side and on the anti-Israel side to describe it as the worst place on earth, and it just is not. Okay, much of Africa is much worse off than Gaza, but you do not want to grow up in Gaza because you can't leave and you do not have a future. You don't have an employment future. You're not going to die. You're not going to get hungry. That's what I want to say about Gaza. What could they do? There are things they could do, okay? And it's a little bit delicate for us to stand here in Westchester and say, well, why don't you do X or Y? So I don't really want to be in that position. But I will say broadly that the failure to organize and to sort of to do things that could be done on a basic level rather than a purely political one is making life worse. So the question is, does the Trump administration have a coherent policy toward the Middle East? Right. I don't honestly know the answer. I would say, if I were forced to answer it, I'd say no. Okay. But I do think, by the way, that if this stuff that I'm hearing about Jared Kushner and Jason Greenblatt and their efforts, I don't think Tillerson is on board with these grand schemes. So I do think that there are struggles within the administration. There's the whole notion of the adults in the room trying to sort of keep the crazy stuff from happening. And I'm sympathetic to the idea that it hasn't gone well so far, and so we need to come up with another model maybe. But from what I see, I don't think it is especially coherent, and my guess is that few do.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jim, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.